Hello and welcome back to World Talks on TVP World with me, Ashim Kumar. Now, as you probably heard just a couple of minutes ago, I laid out the complex dynamic of the situation in Ukraine and whether or not we expect Putin to halt his offensive over the winter period. Now, many analysts have different ideas of what's going to happen, but to help us unpack all of that, we are joined by our very special guest, Mr. Stefan Korshak. He's a senior defense correspondent at the Kyiv Post. Mr. Korshak, welcome to TVP World and thanks for taking the time.
Thank you for having me.
Pleasure as always. Now, Putin's on a roll, isn't he? He's making small gains at immense cost, of course, but that doesn't seem to deter him. Why would he stop over winter?
Well, it won't be so much, I think, a question of stopping or going. It's a question of pace and scale. We've already seen some of the attacks in the eastern region, in the eastern sector, fall off in terms of the width of the attacks, but they're still pushing the Russians. In the north, they're also counterattacking, but not on a broad front. So the question is, how wide can the Russian attacks continue? On how wide a front can they continue? It seems like will always be pressure. There doesn't seem to be any plan to back off, but is it pressure that the Ukrainians can handle, or is it pressure that could break their lines?
So we expect the Russian attacks to continue through winter, but on a much narrower front, if I understand you correctly. Now, the thing about, of course, manpower, let's start with that, is that not only does Russia have a larger population from which to draw soldiers, but there are reports of North Korean soldiers also fighting on their side. So despite their enormous losses, last month was one of their biggest months of the biggest losses. How is Ukraine going to withstand that onslaught?
Well, most Ukrainian commanders, I think, would say with firepower. They have probably, no, not even probably, they have the most advanced army in the world in terms of small-scale drones, FPV drones, that are incorporated as part of standard military operations. And they need artillery shells, they need heavy weapons, they need air defense. Their defenses will continue, it seems like, under almost any circumstances. So the question from the Ukrainian side is really not so much can they contain the Russians, it's rather can they, when they continue fighting, at what cost will it be? Because the less equipment they have, the greater their casualties.
Understood, but as you say, the two are connected. So let's ask the question about equipment first. Are they getting the equipment as quickly as they need it? I mean, have things sped up? I mean, we hear about delayed supplies. Well, we have been since the start of the war. Has that changed?
Not the direct answer to your question is no. The pace is slow. It's deliberate. It doesn't seem centrally organized. It doesn't seem focused. The Ukrainians probably, no, I don't think even probably. The Ukrainians would say that the top priorities, without question, are air defense weapons and artillery ammunition. That's what they need the most. That is what they require to defend against those parts of the Russian military that they right now have difficulty dealing with. And that's coming, but not in scale. And you can discuss for a long time in great detail why that's not happening. But from the Ukrainian side on the ground, those are just gaps that are not being filled quickly enough into a scale that they need, in their opinion anyway.
So too little, too late when it comes to military equipment, hardware. What about the soldiers, Mr. Korshak? I mean, they must be exhausted. There is rotation going on, but there are some units which simply cannot be brought back because they're in a critical part of the front. Do they have sufficient fresh men to replace them?
To keep fighting, yes. To put together a coherent offensive to retake ground that's been captured by the Russians, it doesn't look that way to me. They are having units that effectively break up on the battlefield. Not many, small scale, small units, but that simply get ground into nothing because of the Russian firepower advantage at a particular location. They lost a major fortification, a town called Vuhledar, a couple of weeks back, essentially because they knew the Russians were coming. They had the ground taped. They, for years, literally had held the positions very well, but over time, the Russian attacks ground the defenders into bits, and the Ukrainians either chose or were unable to reinforce. And eventually that led to a loss of ground and a loss of personnel. And the unit that was defending effectively was ground into nothing.
Understood. So a war of attrition, which I suppose doesn't surprise us really, from the Russian side. What about the strategic advantage, if any, that Ukraine may have gained through its occupation of the Kursk region, or some of it at least?
Well, they think that they have put the onus on the Kremlin and on Vladimir Putin to react. They believe that the Russian population cannot ignore it, and as long as there are Ukrainians holding ground in Russia, it's extremely difficult for state-controlled Russian media to say that the war is going well. From a tactical and operational point of view, it's a toss-up, it looks like, who's suffering more losses and who's gaining on the battlefield from that incursion. But from the Ukrainian point of view, the primary goal of the Kursk incursion is to demonstrate that Ukraine is still capable of taking the initiative and taking the war to the Russians. How long they can sustain it? Well, they're up against the Russian army, and if the Russian army chooses to concentrate major force, then the Ukrainians will have serious problems there.
But the Ukrainians have, developed a substantial deterrence and attack capability in the form of drones. In fact, they've now started to export the technology that they've developed, and which has proven very effective. How do you see that aspect of their materiel influencing the situation on the battlefield, and also with regard to attacks in Russia?
Well, you can get different points of view on this, but my personal point of view, we're witnessing a military revolution right now. There is no army in the world that uses drones to the depth, scale, and sophistication that the Ukrainian military does. They're conducting a long-range bombardment campaign of Russia with drones that the Russians honestly seem to be struggling to deal with. The Ukrainians hit an oil terminal, I believe, last Wednesday, and it's still burning, and oil reservoirs are still blowing up there. And this was in a place that the Russians say that they have very strong air defenses. So that is certainly the Ukrainian strong suit, drones, and they are manufacturing them with government manufacturing. There's crowdsourcing drones, and the degree to which that they will make drones part of any future operations is really a question of how much resources can be committed. And if they get resources from the outside, then it's hard to guess what they would do with it, because right now, most of their resources are their own.
Understood. Now, in the short time that we have left, Mr. Korshak, I want to ask your opinion on President Zelensky's peace plan. Now, much has been said about it, but he does sound fairly optimistic that by December, there is something that could be put in place for a sustainable peace. What's your opinion, and what are you hearing about this?
I think, well, we're hearing a lot of the bits and pieces, and if you parse the Ukrainian media, it's not so much a plan that will deliver a peace where the shooting stops, but rather a plan whereby the path to the peace will be in Ukrainians' advantage. It seems to be that the focus is on systematizing and institutionalizing Western support to Ukraine, not depending on, for instance, the goodwill of the White House, whoever happens to be in power, but making it a long-term sustainment effort to Ukraine, and home basing as much military production as possible, bilateral security agreements rather than a global security agreement and membership in NATO. And that's the vectors that the Ukrainian media are describing regarding the peace plan. So from here, it's very much how Ukraine intends to go forward. And Zelensky's optimism, one assumes, is that he believes that he's got people on board, he's got countries on board to do that. We'll see whether that happens.
Indeed, clearly membership of NATO and the occupied territories in Ukraine are going to be major sticking points. We look forward to seeing how the peace plan deals with those. Mr. Stefan Korshak, Senior Defense Correspondent at Kyiv Post, thank you very much for taking the time to join us, and have a good day, sir.
Thanks, it's been a pleasure. You have a great day.
Thank you too. And that's all from us here on World Talks. Goodbye for now.